Turn 4! Across the shores of Frorholm, green fire wrapped across the sky. It danced and spun, shifted and twisted, and far below it reflected in the hollow eyes of the stone sentinels. There were scores of them, maybe even hundreds. No one had thought to count the featureless vestiges of stone staring out longingly towards the choppy seas. They hummed in the cold air, the resonance of the island reaching its crescendo as the forge was so near to being free. It was a scratching, straining, atonal sound, what coarse sand was to the crystal of pure note. Yet there were none to hear it. They had all moved inland, towards the castle. The beaches were empty, save for the monolithic heads, yet their call was heeded. Drakkergard! Drakkergard, the final step before Dalric Castle and the ancient forge within. 7 alliances had forged bloody paths across the thawing city of Frorholm, all to reach the fabled prize within. As the last of the ice receded, battle lines were drawn about the old barracks. Whoever took them would have a clear path inside. Even then, victory would not be so easy. This was but one of the 3 contested entrances to the castle grounds, and each coalition sought to take them all. Each, save for Zagradiel and his Teklandek sharpshooters. Zagradiel had been so confident of his victory that he saw no reason to waste ammunition taking every entrance. He intended to stroll past the rabble and claim what was rightfully his. That rabble would not allow him such easy passage, however, with hosts representing each of Zagradiel's 6 main rivals mustering outside the claustrophobic barracks. None had come in such numbers as the Drossforged, perhaps the most disparate of the Elven Lord's shining host. Their pride was built not on high births or fancy titles. It had been earned through blood and hardship. At their head was Ured the Beardless himself, standing proud in his rusted armor, scarred brow set with determination. It was a fine day to take elven heads. First blood was spilled when a diminutive masked grot messenger runner broke from the Mooncalled ranks, heading towards the Mooncaller's position at Doloris Guard. Zagradiel snatched a rifle from one of his flanking gunmen, chuckling as the grot fell to the ground, dead. Chaos erupted in moments. Enraged, the Troggoth Rune thundered from the Mooncalled ranks, his body filled with the strange energy of the Trog bellows. The Teklandek sharpshooters immediately began to lay down fire, but Rune's unnaturally empowered flesh merely knitted about the wounds. Seeing their opportunity, the vanguard of the Drossforged began their march. Ured, the stout Duardin, Snoll Stonebrak by his side, made ready to signal Poxbringer Vericatus when the inevitable occurred. Then, of course, it did. A signal fire from the Blackwing Corsairs flashed high above, alerting the distant Azrak's bastion that those who had stood in Vishkan's way had taken to the field. In moments, arcane artillery began to pepper the battlefield, only those who had planned this action with Vishkan safely outside the impact zone. The Drossforged were hit worse, having stepped further afield than the shields of Anavan and the Shadowsong renegades, but they were also the most ready. Stonebrak's Ruin Throng immediately dropped below shields, deflecting debris if not direct hits from the magical ordnance, while Ured signaled the Dross Fairy warleader behind him. The Pestigor began to chant, and a thick, choking fog began to spread about him. The wizard Valish Kal conjured a strong wind towards the battlefield, sending the fog billowing across the open stretch outside Drakkergard, while the Drossfae's Pestigors surged into the fog. Though they could not see the artillery coming beneath it, neither could their enemies, all of whom within range were already being blinded, choked, and disoriented by the miasma. While many war leaders and chieftains yelled out to retreat beyond the fog, it was becoming increasingly unclear which way that was, with members of the Mooncalled, Blackwing Corsairs, and Wolves of Agora stumbling into the range of their own artillery. This was made worse as the Pestigors, not impeded by the fumes, began to harry their enemies, driving them further into the killing ground. In desperation, the Blackwing Signaler sent up another flare, calling off the assault. As the fog dissipated, the Drossforge surged towards the barracks, aiming to gain a foothold within the tangled maze of walls and buildings within. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Ruin had broken off his assault, having already forgotten what he had been so angry about. He had decided to go after something that stung less, and with a sneer, Zagradiel sounded the advance. The other coalitions had recovered and regrouped by now, each racing towards the castle with small skirmishes breaking out all around. Though there was no love between them, the shields of Anavon had a pact to fulfill with the Drossforged. Though each did not want the other to claim the blade, they wanted even less for the mad zealots of the Mooncall to take it. While advancing towards the city, the shields herded the Mooncall to charge into the line of sight of the Drossforged backline. With a nod, Sir Brannon Darkflame signaled to Snoll Stormbrak, his force hanging back after their initial gambit had put them within the line of fire from Azrak's bastion. With a cry, he had one of his kinsmen fire the mystical arrow they had recovered from the knee directly into the Mooncalled vanguard. The sudden flash of light blinded many across the field for a few moments, but when their vision returned, they found the Mooncalled in chaos. Though Lord Godfrey's Chaos Knights had taken the brunt of the assault on their armor and shields, a few had fallen to the ground, writhing in pain. The Mooncaller's own masked zealots were not so lucky, dressed as they were in mere rags and scraps of looted plate. Only charred ritual masks remained of them, smoking eerily on the ground. One combatant had not been affected by the blinding light of Hysh, and scoffed at those who reeled about him. A true son of the Prime Dominion found mere light a trifle, and Zagradiel shouted for his retinue to maintain fire as they marched. When nothing happened, he turned, disgusted to find his sharpshooters rubbing their eyes, disoriented from the blast. He called for a report from the rear ranks, aiming to bring his reserve forward. What he discovered enraged him even more. The supply caravan carrying the Teklandek's ammunition had been ambushed by the Stormcast of the Forgotten with the aid of the Gargant Junko Homesmasher, and even now his reserve fought and died to protect it. The explosion that rocked him a few moments later told him all he needed to know. His own ordnance had been detonated. He would not be getting his reinforcements. With a snarl, Zagradiel snatched up a rifle and drew his sword. He would take that blasted forge, with or without his useless underlings. The surviving sharpshooters hurried to keep up with him, even as their shots veered wildly off target as their eyes readjusted. But there were a lot of targets. Even while the vanguards of the Sixth Coalition fought and died amongst themselves in the tumble-down barracks, contingents had peeled off from the main assault and gathered just outside the crumbling walls. All with a single goal: to slay Zagradiel. The bulk of this force was made up of vengeful shields, but they were not alone. Zephyr's Luxie dogs joined the Forgotten Knights as they marched through the Teklandek barrage, while slavering skigs from the Skull Crushers, the Corsair's Horde, and the Mooncalled's Loon Knights of Degrainen Moon leaped and dodged between the fire, taking bullets as they went, but using their momentum to clamp their voracious jaws about the Teklandek sharpshooters even as they died. It seemed as if they'd be able to impede the Elf Lord's progress, and perhaps even rout him, when his reinforcements came surging over the hill, filling the air with renewed fire. Ironically, the orcs of the Skullcrushers had been attempting to ambush the same supply train as the Corsairs, but had ended up engaging the Forgotten and Homesmasher when they arrived to find their work already done. In the ensuing brawl, the Teklandek had escaped, and the Skullcrusher squigs bore the brunt of their master's bloodlust, gunned down by the shooters they had inadvertently helped to escape. The situation only got worse when the Mad Queen of the Screaming Court decided to take the opportunity to ambush the reeling members of the other coalitions who had stood beside the shields in their attempt to defeat Zagradiel. Within moments, her ghouls were engaged with pitched battles with the Gargants of Clan Quixote, as well as the confused Trogoth Harry, who hadn't even intended on joining the fight against Zagradiel. He'd merely gotten turned around within the labyrinthian barracks and wandered back into the ghoulish ambush. Desperately, they each fought amongst themselves while attempting to evade the bullets raining down upon them. As things devolved into chaos outside the walls, within them matters were little better. The Sons of Cain, having slipped into the barracks undetected using their shadow magics, now found themselves unable to avoid conflict, as they found themselves surrounded by the grief-mad ghouls of the Flinzers. Below the barracks, forces met in the old sewers, each having had the idea to get in from beneath and beat their foes to the prize. A Skip the Not-So-Wise and Ned Blackpowder found themselves facing with Titus Lashtail and his Skaven assassins, neither side willing to let the other surface. More and more, those who had broken into the city found themselves disoriented and beset by foes on all sides, finding themselves emerging back out into the killing ground outside. This was by design. Only one faction was not participating in any of the bloody brawls, their attention firmly on misdirecting their foes back out into Zagradiel's line of fire. The wolves of Agora had no love for the elf, and indeed fully intended to take his head themselves when this bloody business was done. For now, it served them well to have the ranks of their foes thinned and the Teklandek ammunition depleted. Kido Takara of the Exiled Blades had stolen into the city during the confusion of the artillery barrage, establishing a foothold from which the wolves had begun their ploy. Black Karadak led the wolves' party as they stalked through the ruins, herding their foes back under the elves' fire. Only one band of fighters were giving them trouble, that of Ured the Beardless. The Duarden's ineffable purpose drove him on, meeting the wolves' attempts to waylay him with axe in hand and stubborn refusal to play their game. Even as he progressed towards his goal, however, Ured found himself chafing as he listened to the cowardly elves' bullets thundering and the screams of his men dying. The idea that somebody else might take Zagradiel's head rankled him more than he expected, and, remembering with grim humor how he had instructed his own men not to lose sight of their goal for petty revenge, Ured the Beardless turned his back on the forge. It could wait a moment longer. Finally, their ammunition caravan having been destroyed, the elven sharpshooters began to throw their guns down and draw their swords. The enemies before them hardly noticed, trying to survive in the chaos of the desperate melee that had descended upon the outskirts of Drakkar Guard. Zagradiel scoffed at his foe's foolishness once more as he began to dismissively sweep his blade about him, impaling Mooncalled, Corsairs, Shields, Renegades, and Drossforged alike on his fine steel. One band was curiously unrepresented in the slaughter, and Zagradiel almost believed he had wiped the wolves of Agora out to the last without even noticing, when screams erupted from his already diminished backline. He didn't even look back. Any who died to that rabble deserved to, after all. He had a blade to claim. As he strode on, he could feel it calling to him, feel already the power swelling within him. When he had that blade, Zagradiel decided he would not merely win his way back into the graces of the weak fools that ruled the Prime Dominion. Such trifles were below him, the only true Prince of Dawn. He would take the heads of any who stood in his way. He would stand over the broken body of Dariel and claim the throne for himself. Zagradiel felt a curious prickling at his brow, but ignored it. Anyone else who was looking would have seen wicked horns begin to sprout from his perfect skin. Zagradiel's men suddenly found themselves abandoned by their lord, low on shot and now beset by the full might of the wolves of Agora. They had waited until the gunfire had diminished before launching their assault, not weakened by the strains of the day's fighting. Dressed in dark purples to mask their appearance in the Ogoan gloom, the wolves bore down on their foes, intending to rout not only the elf, but the battered retinues of their rivals. Streakhorn and her Sylvaneth revenants tore into the reeling Teklandek flank first, drawing what little fire remained away from the main assault circling in from behind. Tuatha's lancers joined the ever-blazing buccaneers and the Oryx of Dafinkas in hammering into the disoriented elves, cutting a bloody path towards Zagradiel himself. They had assumed he would turn and fight when his men began to fall in droves, but he did not even turn back. Bellowing, Gorax of the Buccaneers redoubled his efforts, charging through his foes towards their leader. He soon found himself bogged down, his quarry almost out of reach. In desperation, he pulled out a small, flame-wreathed throwing axe and tossed it at Zagradiel's back. It lodged in the elf's shoulder blade, causing him to stumble and whip around to face Gorax. The expression on his face was like nothing the Ogroid had ever seen on a mortal. Horns twisted and curled from the elf's skull, and a dark fire burned in his eyes as he pulled the axe from the charred gash in his back. He threw it aside dismissively and disappeared into the city, leaving Gorax to bellow obscenities at his back. Zagradiel strode down dark alleyways and ruined storehouses as if he ruled over them, stopping only to dispatch any stragglers he met along the way. A bird-masked sneak thief was slipping from his blade when a brittle voice sounded behind him. My lord? It was Calvin, his adjutant, wounded and bloody, but still clutching the Teklendek banner like a child clinging to its parent's leg. Pathetic. The adjunt's eyes filled with horror as he noticed the horns growing from Zagradiel's head. He took a step back, dropping the banner. Zagradiel was about to admonish him for disgracing the blood of Iscarion by dropping the banner in the dirt when a shot rang out. The side of Zagradiel's face felt red. He felt at it, and his fingers touched teeth. The bullet had torn right through his cheek. It took him a moment to notice the pistol in Calvin's quivering hand, and his blood began to boil. How dare this maggot strike against the Prince of Iscarion? Feeling a strange power welling within him, Zagradiel reached out, his hand projecting force enough to send the insubordinate whelp crashing into a bloody heap at the foot of a collapsed well. He only then noticed the gaping hole in his belly where a second shot had ripped through him. Any lesser elf would be dead, but the blood of the Iscarneth flowed through his veins stronger than any other. This was just further proof of his birthright.
When I broke my chains and left Brak-Zagul, I killed more Duarden than I cared to count. Each and every one of them was 10 times tougher than you'll ever be, elf, and I took them down with nothing but chains and my smithing hammer.
Zagradiel swung back towards this latest interloper, prickling with annoyance. It was a beardless Duarden, scarred and ugly beneath the Lord's notice usually, but he supposed he had time to deal with the pest before he claimed his birthright. The Duarden hefted his axe.
Time to die.
They clashed immediately, Uled deflecting swift blows from Zagradiel's sword before sweeping his axe at the demon-touched elf, who danced about the weapon like flowing water. Each got in a dozen glancing blows, each bled with a dozen wounds, but neither would relent. It seemed as if the stalemate would never end when Uled found himself overbalanced. It was all Zagradiel needed, and the elf kicked out the Duarden's stout legs, sending him sprawling, his axe clattering along the broken cobbles.
You thought to stand against the rightful lord of the Prime Dominion? You, a trumped-up slave! I don't think I'll kill you. I'll keep you as a pet to amuse my courtiers.
That's the problem with you elves. Spend so much time gloating that you forget you're not the only man in the room.
Zagradiel looked down sharply to see that Calvin had, with his last strength, kicked the axe back to Uled. The Duarden launched himself in a vicious strike, and Zagradiel was too stunned to move out of the way in time. With a blinding crack, the axe came down between his newfound horns, and the true Prince of Dawn fell, pure blood leaking between the cobbles of a forgotten place far from home. Uled hefted his axe out of the damned elf's skull and turned back towards the castle. His heart sank when he saw the banner of the Wolves of Agora already hanging from the gates, billowing above the crumbled barracks. Uled suddenly felt the weight of his years at the forge. He looked around him, alone and wounded, surrounded by naught but corpses. He'd won his fight, but at the cost of his destiny. Gritting his teeth, he straightened and turned away. Better to live and fight another day than throw himself to the wolves. At the gate, defenses were already being raised by the exiled blades, their allies in the Wolves of Agora funneling in from every direction, fresh from the rout outside the walls. They had taken this gate for Kol Bramir. Now they only had to wait and trust their fellows to take the others.
In the pitch dark of the Ogoan night, a mangled body dragged itself towards the light of the fires at the gate. Zagradiel stopped when a horned, shadowy figure appeared above him, shook its head in disgust, and dissipated into the looming shadows as if it had never been there. Zagradiel tried to move his arms and resume his crawl, but found that they wouldn't respond. His whole body flushed with a pleasant warmth, and at the edge of his senses he could smell perfume and spices. Then, with a final shudder of pleasure, his black heart finally stopped. Dolorous Guard!
Thunder would characterize the battle for Dolorous Guard. and it began with the pounding footfalls of Junko Homesmasher's Gargants. Throwing caution to the howling winds, they made the ascent in great loping strides, only to be met in equal strength by Clan Quixote. The ground shook across Castle Dalric as if in the throes of an earthquake as the two mobs of Gargants brutalized each other. Leading the Moon-Called vanguard came Scuttleboss Scarymuch. Under direction to support the Troll King Arnagir, the Scuttlebosses Arachnox and Spiderfangs traversed the tumble-down ruins and great twisting roots of Dalarisgard with ease. Looking to get in on the scrap, Arnagir loped across the battlefield, his gaggle of Trogoths in tow and Scarymuch on their heels, only to be tossed into disorder as a number of the Trogs seemingly lost what little passed for their minds, attacking each other in a frenzied rage without provocation. Through the confusion charged Jael's light cavalry, inciting a wild free-for-all as horsemen met Spider Rider in swirling combat. His retinue suddenly indisposed, Arnagir Troll King was left vulnerable. It was this opportunity Dagon the Ordained, Stormcast of the Nemean Storm, seized. Stealth was not Dagon's forte, and he marched openly, bellowing his challenge. All but cornered anyway, Arnagir attacked, Stormcast detonating back to Azir beneath his frenzied pounding fists. Undaunted, Dagon's hammer bashed in the Troll King's throat. Toppled and grasping at his ruined neck, Dagon beat him down relentlessly, breaking the Troll King's hands before finally beheading him beneath a dozen thundering blows. His oath fulfilled, Dagon struck out for fresh battle, the airship Damaz Throg raining down fire from above him, and Lord Arcanum Bruxa Alvent now by his side. Yet they were far from the only warriors demanding satisfaction. From his bone-wrought charnel throne, Valinir and the Knights of the Purulent Keep sought in vain for Clareth, yet would not find her here. Gorox Palefor found his way to Dalarisgard, seeking worthy battle. A number of Duardan flame cultists at his back, and the Ogroid Blackwind raiders by his side. They would fall upon the shield's rear guard, hacking and hammering at the soldiers of Exfrentis and the Fangs of Garm, only to find their ferocity met by tenacity in equal measure. The shield's play for Dalarisgard was now set in motion. The nameless Lumineth of the Order of the White Lilies called upon the Elementors of Florholm, calling forth spirits of mountain and wind. These terrible entities were joined by the frothing-mouthed Avatar of Creon and their newly ascended Demon Prince of Arian. Although they moved to set upon the renegades, it was the Blackwing Corsairs' unfortunately timed attack that bore the brunt of the shield's champions. It was Avrina Talonsworn and Markella Virkos that found themselves fighting for their unliving lives, thralls and minions buying little more than a few precious minutes against the two Elementors, the Vargoroth and the Demon Prince. Unwilling to lose more of her flock, Liskia put into motion a desperate plan. Calling upon the Lord Arcanum they called the Forgotten, she found herself teleported into the midst of the battle, surrounded by vanguard hunters who slipped through the shadows of the battlefield with the same deftness as their own gatherers. Reciting the incantation divined from the 8 pillars, she filled the minds of her foes with the image of thousands of screaming, scratching crows. The Elementors thrashed and heaved, while Avarian fought off imagined birds, and the Avatar of Kiron was put to a howling flight by the hallucination. With Avrina and Markella saved, Lycia and the Forgotten Stormcast retreated into darkness. Eager to finish what they started, the Moon-Called's run-off Trogherd sparked off a brilliantly stupid idea. Persuading a captured Weirdnod shaman to enact a ritual of their own, the Trogherd spiked their own Wog energy with the bloodthirsty rage of Khorne. Such were the forces unleashed, the grounds of Dalarisgard began to tear themselves apart around the Weirdnob as he attempted to channel the energy into a single Dankhold Trogoth. All might have gone terribly wrong had the Mooncaller not intervened, its mask seemingly stabilizing the raging magical reaction. Riding the empowered Trogoth like a steed, the Mooncalled rallied to their leader, the Orange Lads, Clan Scorchfur, Leka, and Diator, setting upon their scattered and embattled foes like the rising tide. Junko Homesmasher finally bested, Clan Quixote joined them, the red Rage Wog filling the Mooncalled with the insane ferocity of rabid animals. Those who weren't routed found themselves fighting desperate rearguards as they withdrew. At each other's throats only moments before, foes like the Inquisition of Umberspire and the Luxy dogs turned and fought back to back, their dead vanishing beneath a wave of Spiderfang. Dolorous Guard belonged to the Mooncaller.
The Basalt Gate!
The Basalt Gate echoed with the thunder of the Mega-Gargant Zradnir Whizbag's fury. He stamped and raged, the Shaggoth's corpse already forgotten as he chased down those that had dared to stand with it against him. A storm cloud had appeared around his head, dark gray across his furrowed brow. Occasionally, it would blast down bolts of lightning, striking at skeletal knights that pestered him like flies, though mostly it simply zapped and stung at his face. A few enterprising skinks had climbed atop the Gargant, clinging to its hair or the tattered sails that it wore like wizards' robes. They rained down poisoned darts from on high. For a time, they had attempted to steer the Gargant, but that slim measure of control was gone now. Zradnir was fixated on one person in the crowded melee. A sorceress stood, chanting and channeling magic around her. A feast of magic. His mouth watered. Pumping his gangly legs into a run, the Gargant charged across the battlefield towards her, right into the trap that had been laid for him. Templars and Knights of the Vale charged forth to meet him, chopping at legs and sinking wicked harpoons deep. Mists summoned by the gloom worms appeared, and within them came the chittering shrieks of the Carrion King's children. Through it all, the Gargant charged, smashing apart knights and chosen with shocking ease. Alone Skaven, his Dross-forged allies off fighting at the northern wall, had his hopes for a Gargant Corpse abomination smashed apart by the Mage Eater's errant club. Nothing could stop the monstrous momentum of the Gargant. Smashing through the final rank of Templars and sending Aethador sprawling, Zradnir scooped up the sorceress. The magic around her was intoxicating, swirling, yet she seemed strangely calm. The thought of caution trickled precariously through the Gargant's mind, yet not before he chopped down on the sorceress. Magic filled him, bursting behind his eyes and streaking through his veins. And then the explosives went off. Zradnir was thrown off balance, crashing heavily into the ancient fortress gate. The massive stones that toppled it cracked and shifted ominously, poised to fall into the battlefield below. One half of his face was ruined, blasted away by the bombs attached to his prey, yet he barely felt anything. They had underestimated him, all of them. His eye blazed a blue-white with arcane force. Lightning leapt from ear to ear. He staggered to his feet, throwing his hands out for balance, and white lightning sprang from them. It crashed across the battlefield, arcing between friend and foe alike. The blind Mega-Gargant cared not. He sent wave after wave of power flowing outwards, lashing all indiscriminately. They would all burn now that he had the power. A burst of shadow appeared beside his head, and for a brief moment Cloreth hung in the air beside him. Her coiled body sprang forwards, and from the shadows a massive hook formed in her hands. Sinking it deep into the bone of the creature's ruined cheek, she tumbled past his shoulders, a long tether of shadows in her hand. Zradnir's head was dragged back, his sightless glowing eyes to the sky, and the lightning stopped as he reached up to grasp at the hook sunk deep into his face. Disappearing into shadows again, Cloreth emerged by the Gargant's opposite leg, looping the shadow tether around one of the harpoons sunk deep into its thigh. Again and again she leapt into the shadows, dragging the tether across his body, looping it against harpoons and armor, around his neck and down his back. At last she appeared beside the cracking and teetering stones atop the basalt gate. She was breathing heavily, taxed near to the breaking point by the exertion of shadow magics, yet she was not done. Sinking the tether deep into the stone beside her, she called out into the void and watched as a shadow beast leapt from the darkness. The beast looked like a panther drawn from nightmares, and as it pounced forward, it crashed into the teetering stone. With a sound like God's teeth grinding and an almost dramatic slowness, the stone tilted atop the ancient gateway, then toppled downwards. The shadow tether bound to it was drawn tight, hundreds of tons pulling downwards. It bit into the Gargant, slicing calves and hamstrings down to the bone, and as the hook sunk deep, it tore the jaw from the creature's face. Gasping on the ground, the power gone from his eyes, Zradnir looked up at the figure perched high above. The Megagargon had been an ally of convenience, but when it had turned its powers against her sisters, Clareth felt no remorse in putting it down. Yet there was still a battle to win. Vanishing again, Clareth left the dying Gargant to the absent mercies of the followers of the Great Gatherer, circling around it with blades drawn. Thundering through the gate came the charge of the shields of Anavon. Led by the lances of the knights, the vanguard pressed forward, with Lady Gwynethere at its head. Flaming red hair, streaked with gold, flew out behind the snarling mask of her helmet, and above her she held aloft the newly christened Lament. The runic blade had been tempered in the power of the Troll King's ritual, and it crackled with eldritch energy. With a thundering crash, the charge met the Mooncald's forward line. There was little resistance to the charge, the Mooncald already exhausted from the Gargant's fury, and as the vanguard pressed forward, the scattered survivors were pounced on by the True Blades and Vargulfs that followed in their wake. Yet the scattering of the Mooncald was meant only to buy time. In the heart of their ranks, Pura Bloodrain had begun gathering her power. Bargains had been struck for terrible prices to be paid in the future, and ancient debts had been called on. Yet as the air boiled red around her, she felt it worth the cost. The air shimmered above her, becoming a pool of crimson energy, and with a wet, rending sound, a bloodthirster stepped out of it. It roared and flexed its great wings, clashing axes, then fixed its eyes on the charging knights. With one hand raised in challenge, it leapt into the air and crashed down like a meteor upon them. The initial impact was devastating, halting the charging knights in an instant. A crimson haze hung in the air around the bloodthirster. An avatar of rage and war, it was a dervish of destruction, reaping a terrible toll all around it. It stalked forwards, looking for its next victim, then a golden light cut through the haze. Gwynethere charged forwards, her horse like a grey phantom and the sword poised to strike. The bloodthirster struck first, whistling its axe down in a brutal overhead chop, but Lament sprung upwards. The destructive power of the Trogoth's ritual surged within the blade, and with a sundering clap, it rent through the demonic axe. The force of the blast rippled across her, bursting the gauntlet of her sword hand to reveal the arm beneath. Golden scales had sprung along its length, gleaming in the red light, and from deep within her helm, golden light shone in her eyes. The bloodthirster bellowed and breathed out great gouts of red fire, washing over her, yet golden fire sprang up in turn like an aegis. Raising the blade high, she drove it deep into the bloodthirster's chest, and with a rending scream, it was banished back to the darkness. Their charge renewed, the rest of the shields pressed forwards, surging across the battlefield. Earl Bond chased down the last Mooncald defenders, while overhead Terrorwing scoured the field. In this one glorious charge, the shields might have taken the field and the castle as well, had it not been for the curse of the skeleton key placed upon them by the Shadow Song. Buckles snapped on saddles, rivets popped free from armor, trusted swords broke, and ageless steel cracked. Betrayed by their own equipment, the shield's momentum staggered and fell, and the Shadow Song were there to take advantage. Gifted with knowledge of the battlefield and their enemies' movements by the Algar Ravens, the Shadow Song sprang from every corner and shadow. They strike precisely and with perfect timing, appearing from nowhere to pull a rider from his saddle or sever the guiding bolt of a Mooncald ballista. Bolstered by Clareth's victory over the Gargant, they rallied from its madness and stormed across the battlefield. At its heart, Clareth stood with arms upraised, dedicating the carnage to the bloody-handed god. By blood they had taken it, and let none doubt that the basalt gate belonged to the Shadow Song.
The Black Forge.
Castle Dalrek shuddered to the sounds of the swirling melee all around it. Its ancient bones of black stone groaned at the weight of bodies above. The blood of heroes and villains mingled and became inseparable as it crept down into the foundations, staining the ice that still clung desperately to the sunken halls of the basalt forge. The Everwinter guttered, choking. For an age, its fury had consumed the island in a primordial ice. Since the Iron Sage struck its bindings with the fated blade, it had raged unconstrained. Now it was being strangled. Like a great black hand closing about it, it flickered and dimmed, struggling to weave its storm. Then it was gone, swallowed. The darkened chamber stood silent a moment. The black stones quivered, resonating. The humming pressure that built like a pulse across the island rose. Louder and louder, the pulse becoming a scream, a war cry from the hundreds of empty stone mouths that surrounded the island. A brittle crack filled the empty air, and then everything exploded. Outside the castle, the swirling melee had stumbled to an uncertain halt. Warriors looked around, confused. The pressure that had been building for weeks behind the eyes of every one of them had risen, blossoming into pain and distortion. Some ripped their helmets free, gasping at clear air. Predatory vampires fell to the ground, clutching their ears in pain. The vibrating pressure became a roar, then a blasting wave of force struck up from the ground beneath them. Men and women were thrown into the air, crashing down in a cacophony of clattering plate. Shattered ice sprayed out from the castle's gaping doors and the entrance to the forge below. Black stones cracked, and as the falling warriors looked on, fissures like broken glass streaked through its dark walls. The scream that thundered in the ears, the primal call of rage and hatred that they only realized had been echoing in the back of their minds since they first stepped foot on the island, stopped. And in sudden quiet, Castle Dalrak collapsed. The closest were buried in the avalanche of black stone. Dust and debris washed like a tide across the battlefield, blinding and choking. The ancient structures, held together by ice and sound, burst apart like a spitting storm, and from its corpse, a titan emerged. The creature was tall, nearly as tall as the fallen Mega-Gargant, but with none of the awkward gait to its limbs. Its skin was dark green, almost black, except for its hands. One was pale, limed white with frost in places. Ice had formed across the knuckles like talons. The hand was grasped tightly closed, yet around it swirled a barely contained gale. The other hand was red and black, glowing from within through cracks in the skin like an ember. As it rose, it dragged behind it a massive sword, kingly in design. Its edges were black, yet the core of the blade burned with the same red that had scorched the hand fast to its hilt. Runes glowed the fires of Akshi. A horned helm set upon its heavy brow, and tusks like stalagmites rose from its jaw. The massive Uruk, if such a word could still be used, looked across the battlefield. Stunned warriors lay where they had been thrown, gazing up at it in shock and horror. A name was whispered that had haunted this island for an age. He is here. Morgrek is here. Raising back his head, Morgrek roared, a bestial wah, pure and primal. The sound washed like a tidal wave across the city, bouncing from Blackstone and down to the shores of the island, where it suddenly came echoing back 100-fold. With green fire suddenly alighting in their eyes, the stone sentinels that lined the island shuddered and groaned, and with great heaving motions began pulling themselves free from the earth. They roared without mouths, amplifying the Wa energy around them. The island shuddered, earth split, the idols pulled themselves to their feet, heeding their master's call. With the sound still echoing around them, Morgrek leapt forward, lashing the glowing longblade outwards. Flames leapt from its tip, scything through a mass of tumbled warriors. He raised his other hand, and from it sprang the wrath of the Everwinter. Ice blasted across the courtyard, freezing solid anything it touched. A heavy foot slammed forward, stamping down a skeletal knight trying to pull itself together. Morgrek roared again, and with that, the battle was broken. Cries of retreat sprang from every side, their allegiances and animosities forgotten as they ran together for the road to the city below. Through the broken basalt gate, swarming across the corpse of Zrandir like ants, the first that poured out into the city saw the fires that raged below. Idols smashed through the streets, tearing down ancient stone and recent fortification alike. As the fleeing survivors passed the gate, the closest idols turned their eyes of flame upon them. It would be a fight to reach the sea. In the castle courtyard, as all around him erupted in chaos, Kolbramir stood transfixed. There, in the darkness and rubble of the castle, the shadowed entrance to the basalt forge loomed. His eyes were fixed on a glimmer in the darkness, a shining light that he had seen in his dreams night after night. Restless and relentless. There it shone and beckoned and promised, the reason they had come this far. Pushing past the fleeing warriors, Kolbramir ran across the castle courtyard and towards the forge, towards the fated blade. Heedless to the lone and aging gladiator, Morgrek rampaged across the ruins of the battlefield. Each sweep of his sword, each blast of eldritch ice brought down dozens. He laughed, a cruel and heartless rumble, and raised the long blade high in the air. The fire within the sword flared bright, and he brought it down point first, piercing the stone. The ground shook, an earthquake spreading outwards from the impact. Fissures split the ground, fire welling up from within their depths. A hideous crack could be heard across the island, then one of its peaks sheared away, falling into the ocean like a glacial collapse. The tremors did not relent, and the island began to shake itself apart. Taruk, bosun of the Sea Wolf, watched as the old bull ran into the depths of the castle forge. He saw Morgrek's blade pierce down into the island heart, saw the seismic force sweep out of it. He could do nothing as the ruins of the castle collapsed in on themselves, raining tons of stone down upon the forge below. The war for the fated blade was over. A battle for survival had begun.
Our enemy is dead. But I fear a much greater foe will soon be upon us. Make your preparations in haste, my friend, for I fear nowhere along the River is safe.
Excerpt from the emissary's final missive.